Hello, everybody. There it is. I am Brian Nemhauser. Welcome to the 194th episode of Real Hawk Talk. I'm at Hawk Blogger on Twitter, and I am accompanied tonight by some of my favorite people and some that have been gone for a little while. So I feel like we've got to start out with someone who's been missing. Dayna O'Gorman at Dayna OG on Twitter. Dayna, where have you been?
Well, as many of you know, I did a nice little week-long trip to Hawaii. It was wonderful and warm and perfect and as Hawaiian as you can get. So yeah, it was great. It was nice to take a little break after the holiday. My husband and I were celebrating our anniversary, and so we went to Maui. We had a great time. Yeah, it was really nice. But awesome. I was gone for a while, so sorry to everyone.
Well, we were happy to have you back. Did you have a chance to watch any Seahawks football while you were gone?
Believe it or not, the Arizona game. So on the way to Hawaii, we went on Sunday and Sunday. And so I could get the Arizona game on the live TV on the plane, right? And so I thought for sure on the way back during the Arizona Seahawks game, I'll get it. No, it was the damn Rams and the 49ers. I was so irritated.
Yeah, so I don't think anybody wanted to watch. That's what I was worried about for you is when you have a team not playing well, they're not going to be visible outside. I mean, growing up as a Seahawks fan in Portland, this was a big deal for me because depending on how the Seahawks season would be, they might choose the 49ers game or an Oakland game over a Seahawks game because Portland wasn't assumed to be a Seattle market. So yeah, it does start to shrink the viewable audience. But sorry you missed it. You missed it for a good thing.
It was good. It was good. I went back and watched them. It was so much less stressful after I knew the score, so it wasn't so bad.
Yes. Well, we are certainly glad to have you back. And judging by the reaction on Twitter and in the chat, everyone else is happy to have you back as well. Before I bring in the other two fellows who have been around, I do want to mention for folks that are watching live and in the chat, we are trying something new tonight that you have to be a subscriber to the YouTube channel in order to be participating in chat. So as we've all seen over time, there are weird spam bots that get in there, and there are, troll fans from other teams that come in there. We're going to at least make it a little bit reciprocal. If they're going to get in there, they're going to give us a subscription. It doesn't cost you anything, obviously, but if you haven't already and you want to be part of the chat, all you got to do is click subscribe. It takes 1 second. Click the bell to get notified when we go live. If you want to go beyond that, patreon.com/hawkblogger is a great place to go and get immediate access to our Slack channel. And we are building up a really great donation to make this year. So now's the time. We have a huge off season. And who knows what's going to happen in the next few days? Who knows what's going to happen in the next few hours? We'll find out. So let me bring in Nathan Ernst at Nathan E11. How are you doing, brother?
Doing pretty good. Pretty good. How about you?
Good. I have to out you on something, and you can decide if this is a serious enough offense that you just want to leave right away. But
okay.
I just found out that you have a fish thing, man. Like,
oh yeah.
Like that's news. Like I'm gonna have to use that against you at some point. You understand that?
I don't know what scenario we are going to find each other around live fish, but yeah, go for it. I don't know what scenario you will find me around live fish because I don't like fish. I don't like swimming with fish. I don't like eating fish. No fish.
Yeah, I'm with you on the eating part. But that's cool. I like that. That's something a little different. I like little different things about people that are not usual. So
I have a very healthy respect for the ocean. Let's put it that way.
I get it. Well, as we were talking, Dayna and I were talking about snorkeling in Hawaii and Maui. I can see why that's maybe not as exciting to you as much of a draw as it is to so many other people. Jeff Simmons at Real Jeff Simmons on Twitter. Great to have you as well. And you look like you're wearing a jersey, dude. Like you are here for the season recap episode. You want to represent. Who are you wearing?
Well, this jersey is like 15 years old. I was going through my parents' house today and I had to get some things. And I found all my old Seahawks stuff from like high school years, university years. And I found this Matt Hasselbeck jersey.
Nice.
Found a Lofa Tatupu jersey and that like weird green that we had going on for a while. I found a Joey Galloway jersey. I found like I found a depressing 2005 NFC Championship hat. I regret buying that. But yeah, so I'm rocking my Hasselbeck jersey today. Those were the good old days before Seahawks Twitter.
Yeah. I love that, dude. Well, it's good to have you. And for folks that didn't know, I think most folks do by now, but we are going to do a 2-show week this week. Tonight is really going to be focusing on recapping the season and looking at some of the free agents that the Seahawks have and what to do with them, as well as just general conversation about what's going on with the team, because there's always stuff to talk about there. And then tomorrow night, hopefully, if Evan is feeling up to it, it'll be at least myself and Stacey Rost from 710 ESPN, the Jake and Stacey show. It probably should be the Stacey and Jake show. I might ask her about that tomorrow, but that will be tomorrow night. Jake's been on the show as well, friend of the show. And hopefully Evan will join us as well for that. So lots of real Hawk talk this week. You'd think with the end of the season, you'd get less of us, but lo and behold, you're getting more. So, okay. Before we dive into kind of going through, we're going to go through a little bit. We did our season predictions. We're going to use that as a way to talk about recapping the season. And there's some folks that did better than others, and we'll talk about that as well. Any additional thoughts on this game that we saw this weekend? I'll admit something, and Jeff, I'm going to come to you first. This was the first Seahawks game I've watched twice in a long time. Definitely the first this season, and I honestly can't remember the last one that I watched twice. So I was so thoroughly entertained by this game. I really enjoyed what I saw, and I wanted to see some of it again. What were your thoughts? I mean, anything more that you've considered in the last couple of days since that game ended?
I still come back to a couple of points that we talked about on Sunday. One, I can't help but wonder what if. I can't help but wonder what if Russell had been healthier? What if the offensive line came together sooner? What if they had found this running game? But really, I'm kind of conflicted with the whole thing, just trying to conceptualize what was the last two games, what is the roster outlook like going forward. But one of the things I've tried to listen to as much stuff is going on is tried to listen to as many like radio interviews and hear people talk. And I heard Mark Schlereth, who's kind of a mixed bag when you hear him call games, but he's kind of interesting on the radio. And he was talking about how he talked to a lot of the Seahawks coaches before the game. And they were just talking about how the Waldron offense completely came together once they had that Rashad Penny outburst and what it could do to defenses. And you saw, apparently Mike Solari was just raving about Waldron's offense and what it can do with the run game and how many formations they can do, how many play action they can do. And when they have a healthy quarterback, a run game. So we were chatting today in our thread, like, I don't know if we'll get into this later about Shane Waldron and his future, but assuming that if they do bring these guys back, I think the conversation internally is definitely a little different than a lot of people are discussing outside when it comes to him. But yeah, I just can't help but wonder what this team would have looked like had things clicked a lot earlier. Because you can see like Carlos Dunlap's a great example where they were having them like drop in coverage and playing like 7 snaps a game. The guy had like 8 sacks in his last 4 games or 5 games. Like just seeing everything click was pretty interesting. But I'm just, again, I don't want to get too high and too low off a 2-game sample. But again, I can't help but wonder.
Yeah, no, I think that's those are great thoughts. Dayna, you said you got a chance to watch it, and I gotta say, part of what stuck out to me is I think a lot of what we've talked about, like this is what the Seahawks could look like if their offensive line plays above what they had been playing, right? Both run blocking and pass blocking. if the run game is actually a factor that forces defenses to deal with it, gives Russell some easier throws off of that and explosive plays, both in the run and the pass, and what you can do when you add a pass rush to what's been a good corner group. Felt like the blueprint, right? So I'm curious what you thought when you watched that game.
I think my initial reaction when I was watching that game was, this is who we thought this team was going to be at the beginning of the season, right? Like the beginning, like the end of training camp, when we were all sitting around talking about this and how we had all these great expectations. That's what I saw on the field on that final game. And I think this season, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, is a combination of a million things that went wrong in one season. But I think what struck me most, and actually Russell Wilson talked about this also, was that fact that they didn't care that it didn't matter. That entire team didn't care that it wasn't going to, they were still clearing out their lockers the next day. Nothing was changing. They were all still out of there, but they wanted to make a statement. And to me, that means a lot going into next season. Now, of course, the offseason's coming, and we all know that can be a complete disaster. But I really feel like that stamp, that mark, even though those two games didn't matter, it mattered to them. And that's the thing that I really came away with. The other thing is, it made me really think about this run game. Has there been a decent run game out of Seattle? And I know Nathan is probably vomiting. Sorry, Nathan. We're going to talk about the run for just a minute, sweetheart. Sorry. But Seattle hasn't really had a run game in years, right? An effective one. It's been a minute, because every time they get something going with Chris Carson or whoever, they're hurt. They're broken. We lose 3 in a game. You know what I mean? And so I do think that had a lot to do with it. But what I came across mostly is that people were being used properly. And we have to remember how many people were out of that Arizona game, right? Like Bobby Wagner was not there. Jordan Brooks looked amazing in that game. And so anyway, that's what I came away with for the most part, was just that this was the team I expected. I'm sad that it took them that long to get it together for the 1,000 reasons it did throughout the season. But it really, well, it didn't change my thought process, although I know my thoughts are different on the offseason than your guys' thoughts. It didn't really change it. It just made me even more excited for next season. And that's hard for me to go to the playoffs, to be excited.
Yeah.
You know?
Nathan, I don't know if there are any thoughts you've had since then. I mean, one of my questions is, we saw Russell Wilson at like a enthusiasm level that we just haven't seen. And I wonder why, like in a game that just didn't matter, like why do you think he was so into it? Why do you think it mattered so much to him?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think it had to have felt pretty cathartic. I mean, as a fan, it felt very cathartic to have them just unload in back-to-back weeks like that. And so for Russ, maybe finally feeling really good after the injury, you know, he's been through a lot this year in terms of that, and then in terms of just not playing well. That Bears game was pretty crushing, and so for them to be able to come back and play really well like that, and you know, do it against a division rival, do it against kind of a Russ clone on the other side of the ball there, that had to all feel really good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was just one of the things that just jumped out rewatching it was, I mean, the energy and the passion coming from everyone involved was, I don't know, it was refreshing. It was refreshing. And it added to, I think, what was, you know, a kind of a feel good end to what has been a really crappy season. So, yeah. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what we had thought this season was going to be. I think that's a good segue into where we thought things were going to go versus where they did. From a record standpoint, none of us were very close. I think the lowest amount of wins predicted was 11. So, you know, I think both Nathan and Evan and Josh predicted 11 wins. The rest of us picked 12 wins. The closest, if you really want to get the closest, the earliest exit was picked by Evan. He picked a wild card loss. So I don't know that anyone deserves a lot of credit for those predictions.
I'll push back a little bit though. The Seahawks lost 4 games this year by 3 points or less.
Yeah.
With absolutely horrific quarterback play. So there's the Saints game, the Steelers game with Geno. And there's the Washington game, and I'm missing one. The Bears game. That's 4 losses within 3 points with like extremely subpar. If you had average quarterbacking, I think they go 4-0 in those games, and that's 11 wins. I think that's essentially what this team was. I don't think we are off base.
I don't know, man. That's
I don't know, point differential.
I get where you're coming from there.
Listen, we're all taking out, but I don't think that's like a crazy take. I think this was sort of the same team it's been the last few years.
So add to what you're saying. I mean, the Seahawks end up finishing 8th in DVOA, which to me is crazy. But I think this offense was awful, like awful for most of this season, like eye-gougingly awful. And I even think, I think so I'll put my take out there, and I want to hear from you guys on this. I think one of the biggest myths that was out there is that the Seahawks were playing well before Russell got hurt. Like, I don't think so. The Indianapolis game was the only game I thought they were playing well. Even the Tennessee game in the first half, where they were ahead by a lot, there's a lot of broken coverages. Like, I just didn't see this. The Seahawks were boom or bust. Like, the offense was just not reliable. The Minnesota game, same kind of thing. So I don't think they played well until the last 2 games of the season. Like, really? Like, I mean, I guess the Jacksonville game, you know, call that one. But Nathan, I mean, what's your story of the season in your head? Was this like, this was a playoff team that had an injured quarterback, or was it more?
Yeah, I do think this was a playoff team that had an injured quarterback. They were boom or bust at the start of the year, but I think you can't discount either half of that, right? For every first half of the Tennessee game, there was a second half of the Tennessee game. For every first half of the Niners game, there was a second half. And, you know, on even, or, you know, when you break it all even, it was better than it was bad at the start of the year. You didn't start seeing complete games until later in the year. But yeah, I mean, I mostly agree with Jeff. I think this is a team that, you know, very well could have been exactly where we all predicted them to be, around 10, 11, maybe 12 wins, depending on how things break. And yeah, you had the Russ injury, which just throw the big wrench in the whole thing.
Dayna, how about you? What's your story this season?
Like I said when I started, that I think it is a lot of a multitude of things. I think what this came down to is that luck was not on their side like it has been in the past. You know, we've seen so many games over the last couple of years where they squeak it out at the end. Oh, it's the fourth quarter. When do you win the fourth quarter? Not this year. We weren't winning nothing in the fourth quarter this year. So I feel like inconsistency was probably the most part. And then when the offense was together, the defense was a disaster. They never could get on the same page until those last couple of plays, other games. And I think that has a lot to do with coaching. And I'm not talking about Pete, I'm talking about the coordinators, I'm talking about the line coaches, I'm talking about everything. It seemed to be a lot of disconnect. And I know we're going to talk about the coaches later. We graded people and that sort of thing. But I really feel like this team just was never on the same page until the last couple of games.
Yeah. I don't know if it's rare that I'm the cynical one here, or the negative one. But I think I am more than you guys on this. I think that the Seahawks team, talent-wise, was exposed. I don't think that this means that they weren't playoff capable. I think actually both of these things, what you guys said and what I'm about to say, can both be true. But I don't think the Seahawks roster had the margin of error that it's had in past years. And I think that every team in the Seahawks division flashed more talent out there, and they dealt with some injuries, and 49ers especially, and they were able to overcome it with a worse quarterback. At least not the way Russ played this year, but in general, I think that I look at this as kind of a reinforcement of what I think, and I think you guys think has been the truth lately, which is the last few years, the Seahawks have not had the talent advantage. And so what was a team that maybe was, I don't know, call them an 8 at default, but they could be up to a 10. That was like a Super Bowl contending team, and they could be down to a 6. I feel like this was more like a 6.5 team that could go up to an 8 and go down to like 4. Like it just, their standard deviation, I think, is just, it's still there, but it's so they can be better or worse, but it's just a lower tier team than it's been. And so all the things you guys are talking about, if this had been a much more talented team, I still think the season would have gone differently. So for me, it feels odd to exit this season and be like, yeah, this is a playoff team. They just had some bad luck. Like,
no, I don't think we're saying that as much. I think when your quarterback gets injured, number one, like he dictates so much of this team, but I don't think anyone's disagreeing with you. I think we've all talked about the personnel mistakes, the draft mistakes, and this year they were really exposed. And the Jamal Adams trade is just lingering all year because Jamal, we'll get into this later. They didn't have a first round pick last year. Jamal got hurt. We'll talk about how he played later. Not taking Creed Humphrey. They wasted a lot of games on Kyle Fuller, like that Saints game. They lost it by 3 points. Kyle Fuller couldn't block anyone in that game. And when Ethan Pocic came in, they became more functional. If they have a functional starting center all year, they might win a game or two more. Getting nothing out of Eskridge. Missing in free agency. There's just a lot of stuff. So I don't think you're wrong, but I think you can admit if Russell's healthy, it's not too different than the last couple of years where we've seen a lot. Obviously, they had a coaching change, but I don't think their talent level is all that different from last year, for example, where they went.
I'll put this take out there, guys. Based on what I was seeing before Russell got hurt, I don't know how soon the offense would have actually found itself. I don't think it was. I think Russell was making some of the same mistakes we've seen him make and was not having as many of the great plays. And the running game wasn't there. The offensive line wasn't great. And and I think it wasn't until Penny started running the way he ran and Jake Curhan came in. If those things had happened earlier, maybe, but there's no way to prove this one way or another. But my honest gut feeling is it took this long for them to figure out how to run this offense and who to put in there to do it. And I think that might have happened no matter what. Maybe a couple games difference. Sure. And maybe you sneak into the playoffs with a 9-win team.
I think that's essentially what we're saying.
But
yeah, I mean, I don't think this team with an injury to Russ, like I think it's the exact same thing. Like if last year they'd had an injury to Russ, this is what they would have looked the exact same that they do this year, right? Or 2018, right? I mean, I think they would have been a playoff team and they would have lost in the first round. Like it's, it's that whole thing. And I really do think, I think our disagreements on this, Brian, really go back to that Tennessee game. Mm-hmm. Yes, extremely boomer bust. Yes, looked like ass in the second half. They took the Titans the 1 seed or in the AFC. Yeah. They took them to overtime. So for as bad as they could look, they were still razor close to beating the number 1 seed in the AFC. So I think that my opinion is you're discounting that game too much.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, let's go back to some of our other predictions. We'll talk about some more things as we go here, but we won't go through all of them because that's boring to listen to. But there are a few I'll call out, and if you guys think there's others we should call out, let me know. So DK Metcalf was an interesting story this year, and he was one of the first predictions we were asked to make, and we predicted his receiving yards for the year and his touchdowns. Closest to the pin, on this one, and Josh Cashman was closest. He predicted 1,124 yards. DK, I think, ended up with like 975, something like that, just under 1,000. Evan was correct on how many touchdowns, thanks to his 3 touchdown effort against the Lions. Evan predicted 12 touchdowns, and that's what DK ended with. So if you'd known at the beginning of the season DK Metcalf was going to have 975 and 12 touchdowns, Dayna, how would you have felt about that?
I would have thought he was I would have thought he was underperforming, just like I thought he did underperform this year. I don't know
say more.
Yeah, I don't know what DK Metcalf. Okay, first of all, we knew he was going to start to be double teamed. We knew that teams are going to be all over him. We knew that was going to happen, right? We hoped then that would open up things for Tyler and Eskridge, which took some time. And that happened too. But at the same time, I just did not feel that this year's DK Metcalf was last year's DK Metcalf. And I don't know why that was. And it could be because the offense was different. I mean, we have new OC. They could have changed things up. That sort of thing. It probably had nothing to do with DK himself. Probably just scheming. But if someone had told me that he wasn't going to get to 1,000 yards this year, I would have laughed. I would have thought, oh, for sure. So to know those numbers, even though he almost got to 1,000 yards, to know those numbers, I would have thought that he was underachieving a little bit. And that's kind of how I feel. It's not that I'm mad at DK Metcalf. He's a fantastic player. I just didn't feel warm fuzzies about him this year.
Yeah, Jeff, I mean, we talk about the Russell injury. No one ever talks about the DK injury. He didn't practice almost the entire year and is looking like he may need foot surgery in the offseason. How much do you think that played a role, or did you see any reason to think that was part of what was going on?
It's hard for me to say on that one, but I will say this might have nothing to do with the injury. His chemistry with Russell was not right most of the year. And I don't know if that was him missing practice time or Russell being out, but they just seemed out of sorts a lot. I know listening to like the Hasselbeck show, he would just talk about how they couldn't run some basic stuff. There was one game where he just ran like a hitch around near the goal line. Russ missed him. It was like Hasselbeck said it's like a high school play. And I don't know how you can miss a 6'3" guy that much, but all year Metcalf just had sort of a strange year where he kind of heated up at the end, but he showed some like immaturity on the field and he was inconsistent. We had a lot of games where he wasn't being targeted in the first half. I don't know if it was a coaching thing or a quarterback thing where they couldn't figure out how to get DK Metcalf the ball. It was very odd. So he had a pretty disappointing year from that standpoint. It was nice to see him heat up at the end and sort of come together. And you can see how it's just like, I know Brian, you pointed this out, like his energy when other people scoring. I think that was pretty cool to see. But yeah, I don't want to personally say it was a foot injury, but he had a strange year because he had a nice natural progression from year 1 to 2. I think we were all expecting a pretty big jump in year 3. That's usually a huge jump for receivers. I think from all of other than that one game, really, it was a pretty disappointing year.
Yeah, I mean, Nathan, one of the stories I was just found interesting this year was how fans started to turn on DK. Like, I definitely noticed people starting to feel like didn't like his attitude, thought he was too much of a diva, started saying he was a me guy. Personally, I don't see that, but I can, whatever. Did your point of view on DK as a player, either someone that you want to have on your team or someone in terms of his ceiling and what kind of talent he can be, did it change at all this year?
No, not at all. I do think the injury probably affected him, and that was part of the problem. I don't think he ever looked as insanely fast as he has in the past. Still obviously a great year, very good, but I don't think he looked quite the same. So I wouldn't be surprised if that foot was a problem. I mean, and it would be, it might be a different story if he was doing this on a 12-win team. But he was frustrated for pretty good reason on a losing team. And so, I'm not going to begrudge a guy for wanting to win. I think, obviously he didn't handle everything perfectly, but he's still a young dude. And so, yeah, I don't have any concerns about him going forward or giving him lots of money or anything like that.
Yeah, I'm in the same place. I don't know exactly why. I think people just don't like it when players mouth off, but honestly, when you're losing and that just happens, like if you care, people are going to get upset. But I do think, Jeff, you pointed out a few times. I don't think the relationship with DK and Russ got off to a really good start. I mean, they trained together. They obviously were working together all off season, the first year and the second year. And it seemed like it got strained this year a little bit. And one of the things, I don't know if you guys heard this, that DK said in an interview, I don't know, it was maybe a few weeks ago, but one of his big learnings is that even though he feels like he's always open, the ball needs to be spread around. And it sounds obvious, but it sounded earnest as well, that it sounded like he admitted he had some growing up to do about how things had to work. And so maybe it'll end up being all for the better. I do think if he gets foot surgery this offseason, it's going to affect his ability to spend time with Russ, to redevelop whatever chemistry seemed to get broken up this year. So I think they both have work to do. I don't know why Russ has so much trouble throwing to him this year on basic routes. And I don't know why DK, who asks for jump balls and be treated like a big receiver, never raises his hands to catch a jump ball, except for in pregame where he's catching everything with one hand over his head, but we never see him lift his hands over his head in a game. So interesting season for him. Here's one that was fun. Who's going to have more rushing yards this year, Rashad Penny or DJ Dallas? Dana's shaking her head because, Dana, what did you predict?
DJ Dallas. I laughed at that.
Why did you predict that?
Well, because I knew that Rashad Penny would not be on the field for more than 4 games. Who knew that those 4 to 5 games would give him 1,000 yards?
Yeah. And DJ Dallas didn't have a bad year, right?
No, he didn't. He was fine. Yeah, it was pretty good. I liked the run game in the last part of the season. I like a run game, but yeah, there's no one. And if anyone says they predicted this from Rashad Penny, they're a liar, because that no one expected what we got. And I'm thrilled for the kid. He's a great kid, and I'm so glad that he finally got to show, kind of what the coaches kept telling us they saw. You remember they kept pitching him to us all the time. But I'm glad we finally got to that. I'm thrilled for him. But yeah, I picked DJ Dallas, so I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah. I remember us having conversations in the early part of the year where we talked about that. We thought this offense would actually be better for Rashad Penny than Chris Carson. We had those conversations multiple times. There's a lot of outside zone, it depends more on speed, chance for him to get some breakaways. That proved to be true. It just took a while. Going forward, do any of you think that Chris Carson, let's say that they have Rashad Penny, we're going to get into free agents here in a little bit. Let's say they have both of them. Do any of you think that Chris Carson should start over Rashad Penny? I'm seeing no objections. That's amazing, right? Like, that's a pretty big change. And again, let's assume full health. I know that Chris Carson's got some health questions, but I don't think Chris Carson at his best represents the opportunity that we saw from Rashad Penny at his best in the last few games. So that's a pretty big outcome for this season. One of the other predictions we had here was who's going to have more receiving yards, Freddie Swain or D. Eskridge? We all took an L on that one, except for Josh. Josh Cashman, for some reason, picked Freddie Swain and was correct. Keep an eye on that. That's a trend here. But D. Eskridge, guys, what happened? What happened this year, Jeff? I mean, even though we wanted Creed Humphrey, we have video evidence of how upset we were that they didn't take Creed Humphrey. Nathan even jokingly gave the grade of D. I gave it an F, but to D getting drafted. You don't remember that, do you?
I do remember that now. Yeah.
So what happened? Like, is it just the injury he had in the first game and everything else would have been hunky dory? Like, what's going on?
No, it was a combination of things. Yeah, the injury is a big deal. He never really got started. He had a severe concussion. He had to be sent to Florida to go see a concussion expert. And that definitely impacts the way, especially how he plays. He's a really physical, kind of a violent runner. And frankly, he looked, when he got playing a little bit, he looked a little raw. And there were times where he was running the wrong routes. And the coaching staff never seemed quite comfortable putting him back in the lineup, where they had that game, I think it was in Green Bay, where they're like, okay, we got Eskridge. He lit up in practice. And he got like one snap. And frankly, he just never really got started. And they really didn't figure out how to utilize him well as well. And that might be a thing on the coaching staff, where they figured out the jet sweep, but not much else. And I think they need to take a step back, and they need to figure out how to utilize their players better. This is an issue I think we see all over the team, and it's been kind of for years, where they're not utilizing some players well when they get them. And D just really never got started and never got momentum. And really the concussion just made it a lost season.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of see it as like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, kind of like an actualization pyramid thing. Like the offense was so fundamentally flawed. You didn't get up a couple levels to where guys like Eskridge were getting utilized the way I think you'd hope for them to get utilized. He is not the number one priority or the number two or maybe even the number three priority for the offense. And so, yeah, I think that affected things. But I'm curious, by a show of hands, do all of you, well, let me just ask you, are you bullish or bearish on Eskridge future with the Seahawks? Dayna.
Which one is good?
Bull is good, bear is bad.
Fair. Yeah. If
I'm
I
bullish.
like Shane Waldron better, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't understand this offense at this point. And I know that not all of us agree on Shane Waldron, but I just don't get it. So I have a hard time saying the kid's going to be good if the offensive plan is just crap. But I would say I think we saw sparks of talent out of him. And I think that Jeff is 100% right. I think that he never got good footing this season at all. He never got to a place where he could kind of, explore more into his position. And, we have to remember he's guy number 3, right? Actually, number 4 behind
Number 4.
Wayne, right? And so I think that we'll have to see if next year he can make that jump. If he makes a good jump, then yeah, I'll be a little bullish on him. And I don't expect him to turn into DK Metcalf. He's a different kind of player, but I don't know. I just don't like the offense, but we'll see. We'll see.
Tommy Eden in chat, Nathan says instead of bull or bear, he's man, bear, pig on Eskridge for the South Park fans out there.
That's good or bad?
So
I could really go. Yeah.
Do you, Nathan? Are you bullish? Do you feel good about his future, or bearish? Do you feel bad about who Eskridge is going to be?
It's hard. I guess I'm bearish just because it's so hard to say. I mean, it was a loss for sure. It's a little concerning that he was running wrong routes. There's a clip I tweeted out where DK is like yelling at him pre-snap, "Hey, you need to adjust your route," and then he doesn't, and the ball's nowhere near him, and DK's like, "Hey, I told you," and DK's like, D just kind of looks like he's a little deer in the headlights. So that combined with his age and stuff, he's already an old rookie. I'm super excited about where his ceiling is right now.
Jeff, any additional thoughts there? You already talked about D, so you think with all that you mentioned that there's still reason to be hopeful about what kind of player he can be?
I do. I would buy stock in him. I think his value is pretty low right now, but
I agree.
I think everything we thought when we saw him play, just in the first preseason game we saw him, and the stuff we thought he can do from the draft, I still think all of that applies. But yeah, there's certainly concerns. His age is certainly something we'll have to talk about with some of the issues with this team's drafting. It's not great. And one of the concerns, he played at a small school, and like Nathan said, it's a big jump. And combining all those things, there's definitely reasons to be skeptical. But I still think once he gets that second year, we see it a lot. Like Darrell Taylor, if you asked us what we all thought of Darrell Taylor last year, obviously I don't think they're similar. Darrell Taylor's got a way bigger ceiling, but I think a lost year isn't the biggest deal for a guy. I think with a full off season, hopefully he can take a jump, but there's definitely reasons to be skeptical.
I just think I saw the tools with this kid. So I'm still very bullish. We heard Pete Carroll in the press conference, or maybe it was the Pete Carroll show, talk about that he's going to be involved in the kicking game. They kept him out of it this year, partly because of the concussion, but he's going to be the punt returner next year. Like, I think there'll be things we'll see from him that will help this team. Definitely anyone but Freddie Swain returning punts would be great. So let's move it along a little bit. Interestingly, we talked about where the team would finish in offensive rank for points scored and defensive rank for points scored. And this is pretty friggin' important for what kind of team you're going to be. And almost all of us, except for Nathan, picked this team to be a top 5 scoring offense. And Nathan picked them to be 6th. So not like Nathan was super, negative. They finished 16th. Okay, so that's not even the top half. Well, yes, it's not even really the top half of the league. It's right at the halfway point. Whereas with the defense, and by the way, the previous year, the team had been ranked 7th in points scored. So we were all predicting them to get better. They actually got worse. Previous year in defense, they had ranked 16th in points allowed. Just about everybody picked them to be, Evan had him at 19th, Derek had it 17th, Josh had him at 20th, Nathan 13th, Jeff 14th. Dayna ended up being the closest. I'm very bitter about this one, Dayna, because you ended up with 12. But you know why? Because of Russell Wilson. 14 points in this last game because of Russell Wilson go against the defensive points allowed, but they had nothing to do with that. So I would have taken that home, and you'll understand why I care about this when we get to the totals at the end here. But
weren't they 7th in offense in DVOA?
Well, that's not what the prediction is.
I know, but Nathan nailed it.
No. That's a different prediction entirely.
Let's listen to that for a minute here.
Of course.
Nathan cares about the more progressive stats, not the old.
Well, next year we will do DVOA just to make you guys happy, but you don't get to change stats. Like,
okay.
So
technically my 6 on the offense was a typo. I meant to say 16, so I would have nailed it.
That I buy. That actually makes more sense. But honestly, like, is it as simple as the story this year is that the offense just like dramatically underperforms, and quarterback injury and all that, but offense wasn't what we thought it was going to be, and defense for me was better than I thought it would be. It was right around there. Where are you guys on that? How do you think about that? At least maybe talk a little bit about the defense. Dayna, what are your thoughts?
I was impressed with the defense. Here's the thing that drives me insane. I would still prefer Ken Norton was not our defensive coordinator. Now, I know that he always manages to figure it out toward the end of the season, but why the hell does it take so long to come up together? I hate it. It drives me insane. I liked the way this defense, I would like more depth on this defense, but I really liked the way that it kind of came together. And you guys can bitch about Jamal Adams all you want, but I really still am very glad he's on the team. And I think that he is an important figure on this team. Whatever you want to say about his trade, I'm glad he's here. And I think that they used him one way the first season and totally different the second season. That could be a whole show, right? So anyway, I was impressed with the defense. I like that Dunlap came along. I love Quandre Diggs. And I can't wait for him to.
So glad you weren't there to see that part of it.
Oh my God, broke my heart.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. I think this defense, they were so good at the end of the year. I still don't want Ken Norton there. I still want a new DC in there. You guys know who I want in there. But I think that this defense was impressive and ended up being better than I expected after probably 3 or 4 games. I thought it was going to be a nightmare after 3 or 4 games.
Yeah, I mean, Nathan, we've gone back and forth on this in various ways, and certainly not looking to rehash all of that in terms of which numbers matter. But looking at personnel, like I think we talked about the cornerbacks at the beginning of the year, and we're like, oh my God, what's the cornerbacks are going to be a huge flaw. We had questions about how things were going to perform at linebacker. We had questions about actually, for the most part, there was some optimism about pass rush. But how do you feel about the personnel, like in general on defense relative to how you felt about them last year?
I mean, obviously I have a ton more confidence in DJ Reed, putting together now an entire season. So I think the talent, I don't think it's far off from what I thought it would be, but I do think it's probably better, probably exceeded my expectations. Especially, Trey Brown played really well for the few games he played. Sydney really held that down well. So once Trey Flowers got out of here, and Brooks had some learnings, but I thought he played probably a little better than expected, and I was pretty hopeful for him. So, yeah, I mean, question at the end of the year, I think, is really about that defensive line and how you maximize the pass rush. But even there's things to hold on to, with Taylor and Robinson should continue to develop, and Dunlap played well in the year, and Monet, Woods, Puna, they're still good at stuff that they do, even if you don't have a star there. So yeah, I think overall the talent comes out, better than expected.
Any thoughts from you, Jeff, on the defense? We're going to start talking about grades, player grades after this. So we'll get into some more specifics, but yeah, I mean, relative to what you expected of this defense, compare and contrast to what actually happened.
Yeah, I think Nathan covered a lot of the points I would have made. I think the pass rush to me was an area I was excited about. I thought their depth would really help. And really, I think it was a coaching issue. I think it was a talent issue. Other than Daryl Taylor, there wasn't a lot to be excited about until Carlos Dunlap surged at the end of the year. And I thought their usage of Dunlap was strange, and I don't think they used him very well. And once he caught up fire in the last, you saw what we saw last year. Their use of Jamal Adams was a little strange this year, and they didn't get the most out of him. I know he was more sound in coverage, but I don't think you're paying that kind of price for an average coverage player. I don't even know if average might be strong. I think their cornerback group was a lot better than what we would have thought. We all wanted Richard Sherman. I think that would have proved to be a big mistake. Richard's body just didn't hold up this year. He went on the IR twice in like 7 weeks, and I think they would have wasted snaps on him instead of guys like Sidney Jones and Trey Brown. And I think we were most of us were wrong about that. And seeing them develop like 3 corners, and I was one who thought the corners would be a little better than everyone else did once they got rid of Flowers. I thought if Reed played on one side and they got something on the left side, but they got pretty good play by the end. So that shocked me. But again, there's not enough building blocks on this defense. We saw some good stuff from Taylor. Brooks really surged at the end of the year, but inconsistency. But really their best 2 players this year were Al Woods and Quandre Diggs. As much as we like them, those are not building blocks to build a sustainably good defense. I think I'm not a believer in the pass rush coverage thing. That I believe pass rush is super important. I believe that's where you have to start with any defense. And I don't think their pass rush has enough building blocks moving forward on the inside or the outside.
Just to be clear, I think for folks that might not know what you're meaning, there's some analytics that indicate that coverage is more important than pass rush. So I think Jeff's just saying he sees it differently, even if the numbers might suggest otherwise. So for folks that want to do something fun, I highly recommend that you tweet at Will Cornell at Rain City Series on Twitter. Talk to him about how great Sidney Jones played. He would really like to hear about it. As a Duck fan, he always respects every Husky and thinks every Husky is going to work out well for the Seahawks. And he had some really positive things to say about Sidney Jones before he started playing. So yeah, just give him a little shout. Tell him how much you appreciate his support for Sidney Jones. So folks, let's transition. We can come back to predictions if we want. But let's talk about some grades.
Should we maybe recap like the final score on this?
Oh yeah. That's for sure. Yes, that's a good call.
Just trying to slide right on by
one
that.
One we have to, at least I have to mention, which is Jason Myers missed field goals. This was one of the most important predictions of the year, and Josh nailed it. 5. He nailed it with 5. Evan, of course, predicted 0 with a very inappropriate way he did it.
I thought he missed 6 this year.
Did he miss 6?
Yeah, he missed.
Okay, so Josh was just closest. He was closest. All said and done, I finished dead last after like being one off the lead last year. I felt good about a lot of these predictions. I was so off. So I got two right. It is embarrassing. And Dayna got 3. If Russell Wilson hadn't have thrown those, that pick and the fumble, then Dayna would be sitting here feeling like an idiot. But now Dayna just gets to feel smart, as she often is. So Dayna and Derek were tied with second to last place with 3 each. Derek, very fortunate on his part because he got his third point when the Seahawks intercepted 3 passes by cornerbacks in the second to last game of the season. Although he was the lowest prediction, so he probably would have been fine either way. Then we get up to the next tier. Evan, who was the leader last year, was third to last with 5 correct. And then we get to Jeff and Nathan, who are so close to mattering, but in the end they just didn't matter. They both got 7 correct. And our winner this year, the big smiling doofus, Josh Cashman, our favorite Texan, got 8 correct. So he was right about a lot of things. And the funny thing is when we told Josh, he was like, I don't know why I predicted that. And this just goes to show anyone that's seen Freakonomics or listened to that, predictions are like, there's no such thing as expert predictions. It's very hard to do. Do not bet your money. It's not a good idea. So let's get into grades. And we're going to start not with players, but with the head of the team. And we broke this out a little bit. We broke out Pete Carroll, head of football operations, grade for him, different than Pete Carroll, head coach. And interestingly, myself, Nathan, and Jeff all gave Pete different grades for those 2 different jobs. Dayna, you gave him the same grade and you gave him the highest grade. You gave him a C for both of those. So C's not exactly like something to be proud of. So talk to us about why, you came.
Before we get into that, can we level set on the grades? Because I'm still not sure. Because so C to me met expectations. Like, is who I thought he was. I don't know how you did your C here.
My C meant average.
Okay.
And kind of like school grades sort of a thing, that wasn't bad, wasn't good. I feel like this year, because we were talking about just this season, I want to make sure everyone knows that we weren't talking overall or anything, that it wasn't that different from last year. And although I think coaching, he probably did a little better this year than last year. I just have a couple opinions on that, but I thought he was fine. I thought it was just kind of average. It wasn't great. It wasn't good. It wasn't exciting. It was just Pete being Pete. It was average.
Yeah, I mean, on the grades, it's always, a little bit subjective. I mean, that's part of why we're going to talk about it, because I think we each come to their conclusions different ways. The way I went through this is exactly as Dayna said, if I was grading someone on their performance, A being excellent and B being above average and C being like, mediocre. And then you get into D's and F's for, below X, not being good. So yeah, I mean, I had Pete Carroll as a D for head of football operations, but I had him a C as head coach. And my reason for giving him a C as head coach is because I do think it matters how the team ended the season. I do think that this was the first time they faced this kind of adversity in a long time in his tenure. I do think it was hard given what happened with Russell this offseason and then what happened with Russell during this season to manage this ship. I think that was a really pretty tough job. I didn't go higher for him because one, I think the results do matter. And two, I think that once again, there was a lot of players and scheme choices that they had to figure out during the year. And the fact that people like Trey Flowers started and Kyle Fuller started for as many games as they did, I think is damning. Like, I think that can't freaking keep happening. Like, we're wrong about a lot of things that we just talked about, but there's some things that are just obvious. Trey Flowers was never going to be great. I think some of us maybe thought he could be okay, but like when it started to show the same errors, Pete's just too loyal with that stuff. And he talked about how much work he'd put into Trey Flowers, and I just feel like it colored his judgment. So this could have been lower. It could have been a D or an F if they didn't have the finish that they did. But yeah, that's kind of where I was with this. Nathan, you also had him for a D and a C. Jeff, you as well. Jeff, why don't you start? I mean, how'd you come to your grades?
So my grading was closer, I think, to what Nathan was implying. I graded on a curve purely relative to expectation. So I graded, if someone gets a D, that doesn't mean they're all playing at the same level. It just means my expectation. But back to your question, yeah, I think you covered a lot of it. I don't think I would have ended off with a C if the season, and like 2 weeks ago, they lost that game to the Bears where they looked pretty lifeless at the end. But one of the jobs of and probably Pete's calling card these days is culture and seeing how the players continued to play for him. And they had every reason to quit on him. They really did. The season meant nothing. They don't have a draft pick. A lot of them are free agents. They had every reason to quit. So getting those guys going in the last 2 weeks, and they were in a lot of close games this year where they looked like they had talent deficiencies, and they had Geno Smith in there. I don't think like his in-game decisions were great this year, but there weren't as many games that came out thinking like if Pete managed the game better, they might have won. But from an overall standpoint, I agree with what Brian said. I think there's a lot of issues where it comes from the top down, where they're not surrounding themselves with enough good coaches. Like you're seeing the head coaching interviews around the league right now. Is one Seahawk guy and mentioned? No, there's not even. I haven't thought when there's talk of him getting fired, like who could be an interim coach on the staff? I couldn't think of anyone. So I don't think they're doing a good enough job there. I think we talked about the personnel decisions. I don't think they're prioritizing the lines well enough. I think that's a team issue. I think that's part of the issue why they're D. And I think, frankly, their draft pick was very questionable at the time, looked far worse than Creed Humphrey turned into arguably the best center in the NFL this year. And then there's things about Joel Adams and Dunlap, and you mentioned Fuller was such a predictable mess. And they did it with Brandon Jackson all these years. I'm circling back to him again, but I joked in our chat that Fuller had all the qualities of Brandon Jackson. I think this is week one, and he turned out almost worse. So it's amazing that the coaching staff every year is like, oh, we should have played this good young player more, or we wasted years on Drew Nowak. I think they went on a great rant during the year about how they just keep falling in love with these shit players. And that reflects terribly on Pete. And we all spend time on the in-game coaching and the timeouts and all the stuff that he's very bad at. But he's doing too many things like that where personnel decisions have hurt this team. And he did it again this year.
I'll say something nice about Pete because I agree. I've given him a C, and it's because of all the same reasons. And it's sad that, to me, that's just kind of expectations. I mean, we've seen them really go outside of the years. We've seen them make some boneheaded decisions with personnel and all that, stuff. And now I forgot the next thing that I was going to say. I know that some people on here are averse to talking about such in-depth concepts as like a bear front or something like that. But Pete has been, and Norton, there's credit for this too. They have been changing and adapting and evolving this defense. And I don't think this was especially good. I also don't think the defense was especially bad. And I think there were times where they were clearly giving teams a hard time. I felt like, we talked about it. Kyler Murray did not look particularly good against them. So I think that they're growing and evolving that defense, and it's paying some dividends. And I think that they deserve credit for that continued adaptation. So I think that's the one thing where Pete is redeeming himself a little bit.
Well, so let's talk about John Schneider. One of the tougher grades to make, and I think everyone probably has different ways of how they got to it. I'll start. I gave him a C, and I think a number of you went lower than that. I think Dayna, you and I both were at C. I think the results in a lot of ways were pretty bad. But here's something that I think, I don't know. I think people could come down the wrong side of it. I think the Seahawks even could. I think their process on the pass rush was actually good this year. I liked what they did. I liked that they didn't try to just go and pay top dollar for a pass rusher, which can or can't work. It doesn't always work out the way you think it will. We've seen the Patriots and some other teams over the years assemble pass rushes with a number of lower priced veterans. I mean, how many teams has Justin Houston played for at age 39 and been productive as a pass rusher? Or Terrell Suggs? Like, Von Miller is probably going to be now in that kind of category. I'm not against this team assembling a harmony of pass rushers, so to speak, that are lower priced. It just didn't work out. Like, they picked the wrong guys, and then I think they changed to a scheme that didn't actually really allow for the edge pass rush to thrive. And I think this whole thing that they had the whole year of dropping pass rushers into coverage all the time. How many times we see Carlos Dunlap and Benson Mayowa in coverage this year? Like, why is Carlos Dunlap ever in coverage? Like, anyway, so I think the coaching, especially on the defensive side of the ball, didn't really help with some of the moves Schneider made. I don't think they optimized some of their players. And I think things like, there's different ways to evaluate a GM. I think from a cap space perspective, yes, we talk about draft, we talk about free agency trades. There's all pluses and minuses there. I think the Seahawks are one of the better teams in the league at cap management. I think they've done a really good job there. And there's one other point I was going to make related to, the Jaron Reed move. They tried to get Jaron Reed to restructure. He didn't. They let him go, and they signed Al Woods. Like, ended up being one of their best players on defense this year. So for a lot less money. And as much as I should be clear that the grade here, it was instructed to be not based off of trades or moves in the past that led to issues this year, but what you had this year. So the Seahawks had 3 draft picks. I think all 3 have potential. I think Eskridge we already talked about. Trey Brown we talked about a little bit. I think he might be the best of the bunch. Hopefully from an injury we'll see what comes out of that. And then Stone Forsythe, I think he has potential. So anyway, all in all, I don't think that John Schneider had an F type of season. For me, he was more of a C. Some of the moves just didn't work out. So process wise, I liked it.
I'm surprised some of your bugaboos were, I thought, would give him a lower grade for you.
Like what?
Phil Hanks.
Yeah.
This year. Now, and that one's hard to split between him and Pete because coaches have a lot to say on that. The D Eskridge over Creed Humphrey thing. And then for me, I don't like that Adams contract. And I don't think the defense continuing to play well without Jamal Adams.
That was not this year. We weren't allowed to talk about anything but this year.
He paid Adams this year.
Oh, the contract. I thought you meant
the contract.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, it's hard to, I have a hard time seeing where they're getting like $15 million of surplus value out of Jamal Adams over what, they're probably paying me. I don't know what that number is exactly, but so those were 3 big things that for me dropped him below a C.
Jeff, anything different that you'd add?
No, we covered the Creed Humphrey thing so many times. When you're looking at an all-pro player versus a third receiver who had 6 catches, it's hard to give the GM a great grade. I think Nathan covered Jamal Adams' contract. I don't think that's a great look. And seeing the defense play fine without Jamal and Bobby, which is where the majority of their money is, you got to wonder if their team's being built properly. And it's hard to give a good. We liked a lot of things that John did in the offseason because they had really limited space with a lot of needs. And a lot of those things they had to do with contracts and the fact that they kept the money forward for next year to cover all those costs, that was smart. But I just think overall they built a team that we all thought was pretty flawed and needed to be covered by a quarterback, and the quarterback didn't play well. So just not good enough. Benson Mayo, they pretty much got nothing out of him. And Brian hammered all year about the center and the third receiver. I thought Freddie Swain was okay. I think Brian was hard on him in the offseason, but just too many things that just didn't work out. And they didn't sign Quandre Diggs, for example. His contract got a lot more expensive. And now they're going to have to, if they sign him, that's a lot of money at the safety position to add what they've been saying. I think the plus side of him is getting Sidney Jones and setting up and finding capable cornerbacks. They added 2 to 3 quarterbacks in the building. Even John Reed looked like a guy who can hold up and as a backup. So some good things, but just not enough to get out of where we all graded them.
Yeah, Dayna, anything you want to add about John, or should we move on?
No, I think you guys covered most of it. Yeah, I agree.
So then let's talk about Ken Norton Jr. for a second as the first assistant coach. So you all gave him a C. I gave him a D. Dayna, why'd you give him a C?
So I tried to give him a C minus, but then we put it in there, so we couldn't even do it because I just couldn't bring myself to give him a D because of the way the defense played at the end of the year. But I wanted to give him a C minus. I couldn't. You wouldn't let me.
So how did you come to your grade, though, regardless of what it was?
So here's the thing. Here's the thing with Ken Norton. I don't always think that what he's trying to do with the defense can come across in the defense. And then we aren't seeing the same defense literally from quarter to quarter to quarter of the season. And it takes so long to get everyone rolling at the beginning of the year. They don't make up for injuries well, and that has to do with depth more than anything. I understand that. But I just feel like as much as the players love him, that doesn't make him a good coach. He's a fine coach. We need a good coach. We need a better defensive coordinator. And keep him on the team, put him back, whatever you want to do. I don't care what you do with him. I just really, really want something more from him. And I can't decide because last year when the defense was terrible, historically terrible at the beginning of the season, it felt like, and it seemed like Pete Carroll took over that defense and then they got so much better. I'm wondering if that happened again this year. So I just don't trust him. I just don't trust him as far as I can throw him. But at the same time, the guys will play for him. So he has to get some credit for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Jeff, this was a tough grade to come to for me. Was it easy for you to pick C, or were you kind of thinking back and forth on this one?
No, I was pretty quick on that. I think he kind of met my expectations, sort of how I graded it. I think he's a pretty average coordinator, and I think they did some good things and they did some bad things. And I'm not the biggest X's and O's guy. I study a lot of Twitter and read a lot of things. That's not my strength. I'm more of like a personnel guy. X's and O's, like Griff and Maddie, they do a really good job breaking down some of the unique stuff that Ken does really well. And I think they've gotten more modern on defense. Nathan talked about it earlier. They've made a lot of changes, and I think Ken does deserve credit for that. But there's just troubling patterns where they're not identifying the right personnel. They're starting the year slow. They're giving up these crazy amount of passing yards. They almost set records for yards. I know they're the bend but don't break. That might be a personnel thing, but to me, too much of it is just average. Some of the stuff with players dropping that don't fit that, but I think getting a lot out of Al Woods and getting a lot out of Monet. So that there's a lot of good and there's a lot of bad. The whole Jamal Adams thing, I don't know if that was Pete or Ken, but he said there was that article that I think Adam Jew wrote where Jamal had to meet with the coach after the Rams game, and he was not happy with how he was being used, and Dunlap was not happy with how And we see when Dunlap moved forward how much better he is. So we saw a mixed performance from Ken Norton, I thought. Some creative, cool stuff in terms of scheming and X's and O's, but just player usage and personnel, too underwhelming. And I think the defense all year was average at best. And so that's how I graded him.
Yeah, I was the only person that gave him a D, which might be confusing considering I've been defending the defense all year. Here's the thing and how I got there. I feel like, and I don't know this for sure, but this is just my interpretation. I believe that Pete Carroll gives his coordinators a fair amount of autonomy until things go the wrong way. And then I think he gets very involved on both offense and defense. And I think that 2 years in a row, the defense has fallen on its face toward the beginning of the year. The first game of the season was great. The first half against the Titans was great, but against the second half against the Titans and then the Vikings game, most of that game, especially the second half, like it looked like a defense that wasn't going to be productive. And I don't know if you guys heard DJ Reed's end of the year press conference, but he was like, yeah, things kind of turned around when they let us play more man defense instead of, he called it soft zone. Like every corner who ever lived is always going to talk about that things are better when they play man because they all prefer it. But he also said, and this might have been more damning, you know, for us to get better, we just have to, it's up to the players. The coaches are going to call things, but we've got to do things on the field and figure out what the right thing is to do. Things got better when we started communicating more and making changes based on, like, I don't know. So one of my predictions, if we were making off-season predictions, I have a feeling Ken Norton's gone. Pete's very usually like totally out front when all the coaches are fine. He's been very tight-lipped about that. This time, maybe because of what happened with Schottenheimer last year, but I have a feeling he's going to look at that and see the amount of involvement he had to have and how players were misused. And I think Ken Norton is a friend and someone that is loyal to Pete. I don't think he's adding much, and I just think that that's been exposed, and so that's. Yeah, that's kind of how I got there with Ken Norton.
Hey, can I throw something in there too? I did take into consideration that the time that the defense spent on the field too, because that was a disaster. They lived on the field for so long. And so I did try and take that into consideration too. And yet at the same time, they were so worn out and so tired, and there didn't seem to be any changes in scheme. I don't know. I'm ready to move on from Ken Norton.
See, I actually leaned, well, not leaned. I was pretty okay with my C grade for all the reasons that you guys have said. But you know, if you had to put me at a lean, I would have leaned B over, you know, going lower. I don't know that I agree with some of the not using players well. I mean, we saw them trade Akella Witherspoon. They cut Trey Flowers. But you know, DJ Reed looked great. Trey Brown looked great. Sidney Jones got better throughout the year and looked okay. There were times where they were down to Josh Jones as a safety, right? Mike Jackson at cornerback, Bless Austin, and the defense was still, you know, holding together. It's very possible that Pete is stepping in after some of these really rough starts, and maybe I'm giving Norton too much credit for some of the turnarounds, but the turnarounds have been real, and they're not just running the LOB defense. So they're not just running Pete's defense, right? That doesn't mean that Pete's not the one that's taking over and still calling shots and driving a lot of this evolution, but I'm hesitant to just say, oh, it's just Pete. So yeah, I think. And part of it is too that I didn't have super high expectations for Norton coming to the year. So it's a little bit of a lower bar for him for me. But yeah, I think that they got better throughout the year. They clearly gave offenses troubles at time. For as much as they bent, they rarely broke. And I don't know how sustainable that is, but they did it. So I think that I think we may be being too hard on Ken Norton Jr.
Yep, it's totally reasonable. I can see where you're coming from. Nathan, I'm gonna stick with you on Shane Waldron. So Shane Waldron for you was a C. And I also had him at a C. Dayna and Jeff had him at D. Derek, who filled out for us as well, he had Shane Waldron as a B. He is a Shane Waldron
B for
believer.
bit.
Yeah. So Nathan, yeah, similar. Like, how hard was it for you to grade Shane Waldron?
All these guys are hard to grade because there were it was just an incredibly boom or bust year, like in every aspect: the offense, the defense, the start of the year versus the end of the year, the explosion from Rashad Penny. I mean, there was nothing that was in between or consistent about this team. And so, you can look at some stuff and, for all these guys say they deserve an F, and then there's other things that you can look at and say, maybe they're a B or better. So for Waldron, what I really kind of just where I ended up with the C on him is, I think when things were right, when players were healthy, the offense tended to look good. It was a little shaky in the beginning of the year, but there's a new coordinator with a fairly new system coming in. And so you can expect some growing pains. Then you have all the weirdness with Russ and his injury, but we did see some signs that he was trying that the middle of the field a little bit more, especially late in the season, the last few games. His just overall process looked way better in terms of getting the ball out quickly and on time. And so Russ clearly had some comfort in the system. The improvements on the offensive line helped there a lot. And so that makes it really hard to judge because, that the line just started playing out of their mind, and any offensive coordinator is going to look good when your line plays like that. But so in the end, I just kind of gave up and gave him a C.
Dayna, you give him a D. I like the definitive. C is where graders hide. When you get off the ledge, that's where things get interesting. So why D?
Well, I've already stated multiple times on the show tonight that I am not a fan of Shane Waldron. I wasn't a huge fan of the hire to begin with. I'm not a big believer in wonder kids. I think that they are out there. I think that they are few and far between. I think that Sean McVay and Zach Taylor skewed a lot of people. They just assume that they're young means they're good. And that makes me sound like an old lady. I mean, Nathan called me a boomer today. I'm not even a boomer, but he's like called me a boomer today because, because the 49ers OC is like, I called him a hipster homebrewer. Anyway, so I think that when I didn't have a lot of expectation for him anyway. And then the fact that we didn't see anything really innovative, I didn't see a huge change. And again, to Nathan's point, it was a weird year, like with, the injuries and that sort of thing. But here's what I wanted from Shane Waldron. I wanted a spark we never got. I wanted to show that he deserved the job he was handed. And I don't ever feel like I got that out of him this year. I hate that I was right, that it took Adrian Peterson to come in to turn the running back room around. From that aspect, that's the offensive coordinator's job. That's the running backs coach's job, not Adrian Peterson. And I don't like those. I think that he should have done something about DK in his wackiness at the beginning of the season. I don't know. And I like personality in my football players, don't get me wrong. But I don't know. I just never felt like he was coaching. I never felt that he brought anything really to the table. And again, I'm a little biased, not a huge fan of offenses, but I just didn't, I don't know.
A lot of that resonates, Dayna. I think that's well said. Jeff, you also had him at a D. How'd you get there?
Well, it's funny because I think the last two games are a great look for Waldron. And I think if we were grading I had to clarify this with you in our chat today, because I'm pretty high on him moving forward. I think there's a lot when you saw how the offense came together, how strong that all looked. But I thought going into the year, I thought this looked like a 10 to 11 win team. And I thought the one thing that could raise their ceiling more than anything was Shane Waldron. I thought they needed great offensive coaching to unlock some of the things that Russ struggled with down the stretch, and all the offense sort of went apart when the deep ball went away. And frankly, the offense just looked pretty disjointed all year. And I think Waldron was just being pulled in two different directions, one from Pete and one from Russ. And I think we can get into that another day, but I think he had a really hard job where he was being pulled by how Russ wants to run the offense and how Pete wants the offense. And I don't think he ever found his rhythm. We saw all that motion and deception in week one, but that kind of went away. And there were just games where they were struggling to target DK Metcalf, and there was times where Brian was talking about where the run was working and they just went away from it. And the offense just seemed to never have an identity. And just, you saw like what the Rams offense looks like. And it was hard to just hang their hat on anything. The Seahawks did well. Russell probably had his worst season. So I think that has to reflect on the offensive coordinator. And play calling was a mixed bag and closer to bad all year. So I wasn't high. If I'm grading his past performance, not very well. But in terms of future, I see a lot of potential there. And you remember, like, when Kyle Shanahan got with Matt Ryan, it took basically until his second year for it to take off. And I know McVay and Goff hit it off pretty quick, but it took like 6 or 7 games. A lot of guys with Bruce Arians, it takes like half a season. So I think we might have overestimated him and how quick they can turn things around. But the running backs all got injured. The offensive line didn't play great. But I think this year it's hard to see me giving any sort of positive grade on him because I just think the offense was such a...
Yeah, you guys are convincing me I went too high on this one. I mean, it's true. Like, here's why I didn't go lower. I mean, I think that Shane Waldron probably had the hardest job of any of the coaches coming in because of the limitations of this offseason, and they couldn't have OTAs and they weren't able to do a lot of, like, when you're a new coordinator coming in and to hopefully install a new offense, or at least portions of it, I think there was challenges there. And then I think the decision not to play starters in the preseason at all also made that even more challenging, especially for the offense. And then your quarterback gets hurt early. And so there were definitely some issues there that I think I understand why it would have been a little bit of a bumpier ride. But to Dana's point, I still don't know who Shane Waldron is. People gave me so much shit at the beginning of the year when I talked about his press conferences and how much I was not getting confidence from those. But the guy just came across as a pushover to me. Did not seem like a leader. I was not seeing like that side of him at all. And then you see clips of him on the sideline saying, like, I'm going to call this, Pete, unless you want me to call this. And I'm like, God, it just like feels like it's confirming my worst fears. If you don't have a strong point of view, then you don't belong in that job. Like, period. You need to know what you want to do, and you need to be convincing Pete. Whether Pete's banging down your door saying, no, I want this, you say, no, we're going to do this, it's going to work, and you put your ass on the line. I don't get that at all from Shane Waldron. I don't think that's who he is, and I don't think that's who he'll ever be. And to Jeff's point, I thought he was searching the whole season. I didn't think he had any idea how to call plays and how to like counter one with another. And I've never, we were literally talking about things that we haven't seen. And I mean, the time of possession, they could not get on, they couldn't stay on the field. It was just so bad. And so a lot of those things were really bad. And then all of a sudden, when you have a historic level rushing performance, and let's be clear about that, then you start to see like, okay, I can see how this fits together exactly the way we talked about. So yeah, I guess I graded on a curve. I think D is a totally fair grade, but I ended up at a C there. Anything you wanted to add on that one, Nathan?
No, I mean, the one thing that play with him and Pete on the sidelines was really interesting, or that interaction. The one thing I would say there is he had something he wanted to do. He was like, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to hit Tyler in the end zone for a touchdown. And then he was like, well, unless you want to run the ball, Pete. Right. So, I mean, I do think, in fairness to him, he had a clear picture and they did it and they scored a touchdown. And credit to Pete for, saying, I like touchdowns. Good job, Pete. But hey, Pete is just a dude that can shoddy after 3 pretty successful years for philosophical difference. He canned Bates after a single year. Like, if you're Waldron, you got to kind of maybe have that in the back of your head.
No way, man. Not if you're going to be a 6. You think Sean McVay spent any time when he was an OC or Kyle Shanahan? Those guys do not. they never spend a second thinking I might get canned. They think you can can me, but good luck finding someone better. Like that's their mentality. Like they don't have any doubts about themselves and what they're capable of. Shane Waldron is just not that. I don't think that's who he is.
Yeah,
But
I don't know. I think the situation.
We don't know yet.
Yeah.
So that's it for the coaches. We've got a bunch more to go through. This could go all night. So we'll kind of pick and choose a little bit here. I do think we have to talk about Russell Wilson.
I'm fascinated by this one.
Yeah. So the Russell grades were kind of a broad array. Some of the biggest spread. Dayna was most positive. Dayna gave Russell a B. Nathan and Jeff gave him a D, and I gave him a C. So it is a little bit breaking from probably what people would expect. Jeff, tell us why you started with a D on Russ.
Again, it's all relative to expectation. I think seeing him at the end of the year, obviously, I think I was a little hard on him this year, but I just expect Russell Wilson, especially coming off the offseason he had last year, where he's talking all this stuff, and I want to see an MVP level or Pro Bowl level player, and I thought this was the worst season of his career. The injury was a factor, probably more than I initially thought, just in terms of me, because seeing how much better he got when he was healthy. But there was just a big stretch in the middle of the season, even in the beginning of the season, where he was the worst third down quarterback in the NFL. And to me, that's just unacceptable. And he was just making too many rudimentary mistakes that went beyond the finger. And there's that Chicago game where the season was basically over at that point, but he takes a sack that a high school level player shouldn't take. That ultimately arguably cost them the game. And there was just a lot of stuff where you saw him just going through really rough stretches where he just didn't look like a very good quarterback. And I think a lot of us just were wondering about what happens when his athletic ability goes away and he was trying to do too much and he was missing open guys. There was just a lot of troubling signs during the year. We were talking about trading him, which I've come back around on. I think that would be a mistake in hindsight. But he just didn't look – he looked like Jared Goff this year a lot of times. And to me, comparing Russell Wilson and Jared Goff is alarming. So I just didn't think he played well this year, and that's why I graded him a D.
Nathan, you also had him at a D. How did you get there?
Yeah, basically the same thing. I mean, for the first few weeks, it was bumpy, but, mostly looked like Russ. Then he gets hurt. He rushes himself back, knew he wasn't ready, but rushed himself back anyways. So that, he made that decision. I mean, he tried to get back, he tried to help team and all that, but he didn't help the team. And so I think you have to be critical of him for that. And there were just problems that were, not directly injury related. Maybe it was in his head and that's why he was making some dumb decisions and dumb throws, but he did that. And so he would have gotten an F from me if it wasn't for the last few games where his process and everything, and he clearly looked right from a health perspective, and he was going through it and doing it the right way, staying in the system and all that stuff. So I think it was just an incredibly disappointing year.
Yeah, Dayna, you were on the other side of this one. You had him at a B.
He did, and it's purely because of his determination. So I look at this, and I have to be careful because I don't love quarterbacks, but I looked at this as this is the first time in 10 years he has ever been injured. This was the first time he's ever had to deal with that interruption in what he feels is his greatness. Okay. And he had to take a step back from that. And I love that two things about Russ. I love his absolute fierce determination that he has and his pure belief in himself. Now, bit him in the ass because Nathan's absolutely right. He came back way too soon. He admitted he came back too soon. He should have just said, I'm injured and taken a minute, but he just couldn't let himself. Good or bad, you're right. It cost the team some games, but I admired that at the same time. Would I have told him to do it? No, but I admired that. And then what really turned it around for me was the end of the season and how he was going to make sure they ended on the right note. And that rang super true to me. he could have been the first one to say, screw this. I'm out of this team. I don't want to be here. I'm going to just let these guys fall apart. And he absolutely didn't. And I think that's why so many people like Russell Wilson, so many people in the league, fans, everyone, is because you truly believe that's what he's doing, that he believes it's his job to fix this team and to lift this team up. And I really was impressed by that. So I thought that, yes, it was his worst year ever, no question. But that just really sat with me.
Yeah. I don't have much to add.
No, you don't agree. Look at your face.
No. I think it's really tough because I think my expectations for Russ have lowered in the last year. So that's part of where I don't think of Russ as an MVP candidate anymore. Going into last year, I did. And I think that the things that he doesn't do well have been so consistent. I know Nathan and I have a difference of opinion here, but I feel like a lot of those things are things I've seen for years, all the way back to when he was a rookie. And Jeff talked about it a little bit. I think that his aging is impacting that. I mean, even this last game, he's thinking he can get away somehow from Chandler Jones unblocked by spinning around. Like, Russ, maybe when you were a rookie, like, you're not going to do that anymore. So I think relative to being a Pro Bowl quarterback, I think that he had moments this year, but for the most part, he was just an average guy. And if you look at a lot of the grades, he was like one of the, 15 to 20 range in terms of rankings for quarterbacks. And I think that's who he was this year. So that's part of it. But let's skip around a little bit. A couple things. Two guys got straight A's. They were only two guys that got straight A's. One of them was Tyler Lockett, and one of them was Quandre Diggs. I don't think there's a lot of interesting things to say there, other than, I think that means that they not only met expectations, but exceeded it. Quandre is probably the more interesting one of the two. Were any of you surprised by his play, or like, was it better than you thought? Dana's like, hell no, I wasn't surprised. But I'm more asking Jeff and Nathan, because I mean, this is who I think Quandre Diggs is. Was there anything that was better than what you expected?
No, actually, both of these guys are kind of hard for me because they both had great years. And so, but like, they were also kind of who I thought they were. They're both very good players. So I was like, I oscillated between a C or an A. I just gave them A's because they had great years. So yeah.
Yeah. And I just to add to that, it's not much to add. I think he was one of their best, probably most consistent defensive players. But just hearing some of the players talk about him, I think DJ Reed or one of the other corners talks about how comfortable they are back there when he's just leading them. And they lost Jamal Adams, and their safety play was fine. And Quandre played at a high level pretty much all year. And I know he does a lot of the deep cover 3 stuff really well. And you just see him, he was very consistent this year. He had some missed tackles, but I think overall, just full body work had to exceed my expectations for sure.
Yeah, it's funny. The guy had some of the worst tackles or tackle attempts we've seen. Like, I was like so confusing how, like, there was few that just like he seemed like he wasn't even going to try. Like, and he's such a high effort, like, team leader guy. It's just odd. But yeah, I think Quandre had a great year. Another guy I want to bring up here that we all agreed on, but I think is interesting because I don't know if all fans would agree on this grade, is Gerald Everett. Gerald Everett had a lot of decent numbers, had some career highs for him, but had some just atrocious plays. Some of the worst plays of the season, maybe for any player on any team, like really, really tough games. We all give him a B. That was interesting to me. Nathan, I mean, what were your thoughts on Gerald Everett this year?
Yeah, I mean, on the whole, he was really good for them. He's athletic, he can block. He, clearly had familiarity with the offense, and seemed to have, something of a rapport with Russ, even though there were times where it felt like they should be giving him the ball more. So there were some games there where he was, kind of one of the few bright spots. And so, I think I think he probably would have gotten an A for me at least. But yeah, I mean, when it went wrong, it just went so horribly wrong. But some of that's hard to really just completely kill him for. Like, he had the fumble, and that's bad, that is fumble. And then they recovered it, and that's bad. That's not good. They recovered it. And then they ran it for like a touchdown, right? And so it's just like, yeah, you shouldn't fumble the ball. That's bad. But some of it was a little out of his control too. So I don't know. When I think about Gerald Everett, I still get warm fuzzies. So I give him a B.
The chat, folks, is not loving our grade on Gerald Everett. Boo, Everett's trash. So yeah, I think Dayna, I mean, I guess I look at Gerald Everett and I see a player that, man, I still feel like we've just scratched the surface of. Like, I think given a full season of a functioning offense, this guy could put up some really big numbers. And to Nathan's point, during some of the lowest points of the year, he was the only thing working. He was catching the ball. He's tough after the catch. He just had some horrible moments. And this last game was no different. I mean, that drop was just, ugh. And yeah, I think that might be who he is. Like, but I think I'd still take it. How about you?
Yeah, me too. I like Gerald Everett. And I think if the thing with him is he's not super flashy. And so I don't think people notice when he's doing things right. But when he does something wrong, he does it really brightly in a very important time. So that's what people remember. But I think if people honestly went back and watched those games and watched the way he played it and that sort of thing, they would understand why we do, appreciate and value him on this team. I really hope they bring him back, and because he's a free agent next year, I think. And so I really hope that they do, because I think that he is kind of a vital piece. And once this offense settles in, I think he'll settle in even more.
Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple more, and then we're going to wrap up here because we're obviously going late. So offensive line, obviously something that's really important, but there's one thing in particular. I mean, Dwayne Brown, B's and C's. Brandon Shell, we all give him C's, and I don't think any of us are like pounding the table for him. Gabe Jackson, all of us gave him a C. Then you get down to Ethan Pocic. There's some C's and D's and B's for Ethan Pocic. So I think we got to talk about that a little bit. But before we do, we've got Damian Lewis, who got D's and C's, and we got Phil Haynes, who got B's and A's, and 1 C from Derek, but we're going to just ignore Derek because he's wrong. So what do we make of this Damian Lewis, Phil Haynes thing? Like, let's just take it for a second, knowing what we know about Damian Lewis so far, and knowing that Phil Haynes got 2 starts this year, like, for what it's worth. And let's assume that they're not going to move anyone to center. Between the two of those players, and throw Gabe Jackson in if you think that's in the mix, do you want Phil Haynes starting over either Damian Lewis or Gabe Jackson? Jeff, I'm going to start with you on that one.
It's really tricky. It's funny. I gave Phil Haynes an A, and I gave Damian Lewis a D, because I thought Damian Lewis was a guy who was going to really take a second-year jump. And I saw some good flashes last year, and his pass protecting grade was still super low this year, did not really improve. And he just wasn't really an impact player most of the year. And I know some people think he fits the wide zone stuff well, but right now, Phil Haynes came in and started 2 games, and it was 2 different positions, and he was their offensive line looked great in both those games, and he opened up a lot of those penny touchdowns in the Detroit game. The way he looks like a guy who should be playing every week. And I don't know, Gabe Jackson's locked in for he signed an extension. So I think having the 3 of them, I think is a great problem to have. Let them battle and see who wins. But the guys are going to get injured. Gabe's getting a little older. But yeah, Phil Haynes looks like he's a guy who should be playing every week, because 2 games he played, he was an impact player.
How about you, Nathan?
Yeah, I think you go through the whole process of, many camps and everything, preseason. He's got to earn it still. But I think you can argue that he was their best guard. Over it's a 2-week span, but I think he played as well as either of those guys played the entire year. So I think he's right there in line to earn a starting spot. But I think you bring all three back, and like I said, you just go through the process and see who wins it.
Yeah, and they will all be back. Phil Haynes is a restricted free agent, so we expect him back. But to Nathan, to your point, part of the reason I think, to me, I'd want Phil Haynes to be one of the starters, going into it. Who knows? I agree with, obviously you have to go through camp and battle it all out, and then the others to battle out for the other position is, I felt like what we saw from Phil Haynes in those 2 games was a level of play that we weren't seeing from the other 2 guards in the other games. And some of those guys were playing in these same games with him. So I just saw a guy that, and yes, I've been a Phil Haynes fan, so I'm enjoying that part of it. But setting that aside, I saw a guy that should be part of a good offensive line. Like, he looked like a very solid player. That got me excited. I don't see that with Damian Lewis enough yet. So as much as I'm glad he's on the team and I'm fine with having him around, I would be disappointed if the team once again starts the year with Damian Lewis and Gabe Jackson at guard. Phil Haynes is sitting on the bench. I think that would be one of those things where we're like, why did they do that again? So that's kind of where I'm at with that point. Dayna, Ethan Pocic. You had him at a D. Jeff and Nathan had him at a B. I want you guys to duke this out. Tell me what's the real grade here and why? Dayna, you get started.
I can't figure out how the hell they got a B. Like how well, because they graded differently than me. They said expectation, and maybe he exceeded their expectation. But if your expectation is crap, a higher level of crap is that B? I don't even know. I hated our center position all season long. It needs to be changed. We've been beating that drum forever. They need to go out, get a center, bring him in, flush the rest. I'm just over it. I didn't like what I saw. I didn't like the consistency. It got better toward the end of the season, like everything else, but it's just not good enough.
It's extremely good, actually. You don't have.
I said good enough.
No,
good
I mean,
enough.
I'm saying it's good. I'm saying it's good. It is good. You don't have Rashad Penny doing what he's doing without that offensive line playing really well, and Pocic was literally at the center of it. He plays well. He is literally at the center of it.
No, I was laughing at your joke.
Okay. I was like, I don't know what you're rolling your eyes about. He's literally a center. But no, I mean, he played well. He is not a mauler. He's not moving guys. He doesn't get the most credit for it. You have guys like Curran and Phil Haynes coming in and playing really well and pushing guys around. But Pocic is doing all of the things that you want a center to do and how he plays around those guys. And so, I mean, obviously light years better than Kyle Fuller. So I think that there's absolutely a need to bring in competition, just because it's not something that you've seen from him consistently throughout his career. But if you can get that level of play out of him for several more weeks, and I mean, with Haynes, we're talking about 2 weeks. With Pocic, we're talking more about 4, 5, 6 weeks. So, I think that you can expect him to play well into next year. And I think that, even if you do bring in, some mid-tier free agent center, I think that he'll be expected to win that job from them.
Yeah, Jeff, I mean, I don't know if you've got much on Pocic. I just, I see a guy that at his best is like maybe slightly above league average center. And that's over the course of a full season. Can he have games where he's good? Yeah. I just think his flaws are unsolvable. And I give Nathan credit for, we talked about Ethan Pocic way early on, and I was watching him in training camp and I'm like, well, he looks like he's not that strong. He gets pushed back. Maybe he can develop that. Nathan's like, I don't think people get stronger.
Players don't change.
Yeah, as much as I don't agree with that, that was your point at that point, and so far that's proven true with Ethan Pocic. He is just not a strong dude, and I don't think that's ever going to change. And I think that we saw that this year. There were some just atrocious games. So for me, he's a C. Like, I agree with you guys. He played better at the end of the year. If the team builds up everything else around and is great, is Ethan Pocic the worst possibility at center? No, but man, you don't have many chances to improve your O-line, and I want them to improve that position. So for me, anything above C is hard to understand. You had him at a B.
Yeah, I think in the context of Ethan Pocic, he played as well as he can. So I gave him a B. Again, you said this is not predictive grade. I do not particularly care if he comes back next year, but as Nathan said, he played well this year, and he really stabilized things at times. He had games where he was grading close to, I think, 90 by PFF. And compare that to Fuller, who was probably the worst graded player on the team. That helped a little bit just to function, stabilize the offense. So again, I was pretty annoyed when they signed him in the first place. He's not a guy I would be very excited about, but again, I graded in the context of expectations where mine were very, very low. I thought he played as well as he could play.
Well, yeah. Oh, sorry. Finish your thought.
Too much time on Pocic, to be honest.
Well, we will always have Kyle Fuller's 0.0 pass blocking grade game this year. That will be 2021 in a nutshell. I'm tempted to bring up Rashad Penny because a couple of you had him at a C, which I can't. Nathan, you had him at a C. How can you? I got to at least ask. How do you get Rashad Penny at a C?
I don't think we saw anything from him that we haven't seen in the past.
What?
In terms of ability, yes, it turned into more yards this time because the offensive line was playing so well and they were opening up some gaping massive holes for him. But I mean, Rashad Penny is fast. We've known that about Rashad Penny, right? He's fast, he's big. So you let him go untouched into the second level, and he's going to give DBs problems. So I just didn't see like what it was that people are suddenly gaga over. I don't think he's a different guy than he was a couple of years ago when they were using him in tosses constantly, and he almost averaged 5 or 6 yards a carry.
Yeah, but Quandre Diggs wasn't a different guy, and he had a good season, and so you gave him an A. Relative to expectations, you really think? Well, I mean, it doesn't matter that much, but like it's surprising to me. I guess the thing that makes the most sense to me is that you're giving maybe higher percentage of credit to the offensive line for what happened than Penny. So maybe that's
sample size is good for him. Penny was good for 5 weeks, right?
He did in 5 weeks what people don't do in seasons. Like I think the sample size thing is really hard to throw out there when he's doing things that have almost never been done before in the history of the league. Like that, I know what you mean. Like,
did it for 5 games. I think that has to be part of the grade.
Of course.
Or else, if that sample size doesn't matter, he's getting an A+ from all of us.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't think Nathan, based on what we just heard, would you giving him an A?
Yeah, fair. I would have given him an A+. Yeah.
Sample doesn't really have a ton to do with it for me. I mean, I don't know. Like I said, I went back and forth on Quandre and Tyler. Tyler, for sure, I think, he had his best year in terms of yards, I think, right? So I think the A is pretty fair there. But yeah, I mean, if you wanted to say that Quandre Diggs just was who he was, then I wouldn't argue with that too much, actually.
People in the chat, Ethan Chamberlain says Nathan just hates running backs. But I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. I have a better understanding of your reasoning, even if it's not something that makes sense in my brain, but I understand where you're coming from. So
I think Dayna wants to yell at me.
Do you want to?
No, okay.
So we have other grades, and we can share those. I can post them online or something. It'd be probably interesting to talk about Jamal Adams a little bit. Obviously Jason Myers was awful. Carlos Dunlap's kind of an interesting conversation, but given the time, let's just close by talking a little bit about the news that came out today around Pete and John. Mike Silver tweeted that expect news to be clarified, hopefully as soon as today. We then heard from Bob Condata of the Seattle Times that the meeting with Jody Allen is actually happening tomorrow. And then there was also a report that who was that? Was Jeremy Fowler? I think he's of ESPN, if I remember right, saying that Pete's not ready to retire. They don't expect maybe changes in who's on the team, who's part of the organization, but there might be some conversation about who's responsible for personnel and changes there in terms of who's in charge and whether Pete would give that up to John as part of that starting to transition to where Pete will eventually retire. So those all happened today. For Pete's piece on this, he said after the game and then even on Monday, I'm in great shape. And if anybody, it's amazing to me how much the press kind of just bought that. They asked in different ways, but they kind of just bought that. But anyone that's listened to Pete knows that can mean multiple things and smiles when he says it. And then even he said in one of the press conferences, I just say that because it gets me to the next question. He said that. So I swear to God, he could be talking about his physical fitness. Swear to God. That would not surprise me. And I don't think he'd lose a single second of sleep thinking that anyone felt misled. So, all right. I will just start off by saying, I do think, and I tweeted this yesterday before all this Mike Silver stuff even came out, or maybe it was this morning, but in any event, before the tweets, I do think that there's one potential outcome here where Pete is not with the organization. And it's that Jody and Bert Cold or whoever say, hey, based on our evaluation and the people we've talked to, we think the personnel needs to be done differently. And Pete, we need you to relinquish control of that and to really focus on coaching. Pete came to Seattle with one of the number one thing he said that was going to be different this time than the last time he was in NFL was that he was going to have say over personnel. He could choose to say, no, I'm not going to give that up. And they mutually decide to part ways. So I think that still is a possibility. And that would be, it doesn't mean that they want to fire him, but that might be a hard line for ownership. And it might be a hard line for Pete and they can't come to agreement. So I think that's the setting. Jeff, I think you've had some conversations with folks around the league. What's your point of view?
So I think the first thing is anyone who's making a guess or an idea that Pete is safe, I think they're guessing. I think they're reading tea leaves. I know Fowler even said there are some in league circles who assume he's safe. I think what we've learned just from the last few days is that no one really has a direct line in the media to Jody Allen or Cole, or they're just purposely keeping private. And even Ian Rappaport went on Pat McAfee and went on Rich Eisen and said, I have no idea what they're going to do. And for him, that's super rare. He's got the number one tie to every team. He works for the league. So I think this meeting tomorrow that Bob reported is tomorrow is really, really important. I think we're going to get clarity on what happens. And I think things could go many ways. We don't know what Jody's thinking and no one in the league does. There's no one who knows. So anyone who's reporting anything on Pete is guessing. Number two, the biggest thing that came out with that Fowler story, I had a different read than some of the people in the chat. And a lot of people focused on that Pete thing. And I think Brian made the point that personnel could change. I think the last sentence in there, and it was kind of hidden, I think that to me jumped off the page where apparently a lot of people, and Brian, you've mentioned this before, which is interesting, that personnel people on the team have felt hamstrung by the coaches. And Brian, you've mentioned that they've deferred to coaches too many times in the past. So I think if Fowler doesn't have a direct line to Jody Allen, and I don't think he does, I think that's coming from someone. And I think that's coming from either John or someone in his personnel department, maybe not John. Someone's leaking that they want personnel control. And Pete, we know from Brian's point, Pete had a really rough go of that in New England where people were like backdooring him to Robert Kraft, and he had a really dysfunctional environment. So I think if that story's coming out, someone from that front office wants them to take personnel control. And I think Nathan sort of alluded to some unrest possibly between Pete and John. So I found that really interesting coming into that meeting.
Nathan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I, I, I don't think that's crazy to think that there could be a battle here between John or the personnel department and Pete. I think that's a little, when I was talking about that on the post game show, we were talking about the earlier report that it seemed like John and Russ were safe and that Pete might be out. And that to me definitely, I mean, at least John has to be on board with that if that happens. If John is angling to steal the personnel control from Pete, that's a little bit of a monkey paw situation where, if it doesn't get better and you went and took personnel control, well, you're kind of next on the chopping block. So, I don't know if that's as much of an issue here. But yeah, I don't know. Is there anything interesting that no coaches have been hired yet? Because no one's been hired, right? Quinn's still waiting. No one's been hired. Is that where are we usually on a timeline here? It seems fast to have hired a coach by now, right?
Yeah, it's only been 3 days.
It can happen, but I think usually we start seeing it the week after the wild card weekend when some of those decisions start getting made.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't know. So, I don't know if there's like a domino thing here where maybe some people are looking at the Seahawks to see what happened before, taking jobs elsewhere. But it seems like it's a total black box right now. And I think the likeliest thing is everybody comes back. But there's not many scenarios that I've heard that sound completely outlandish to me.
Yeah. Dayna, I mean, if the news does break tomorrow that Pete and the Seahawks are parting ways, how would that feel? Like, what would your reaction be to that?
Well, I think I said before when we were talking about this that it would be heartbreaking to me, but it would be heartbreaking to me for a couple of different reasons. The word Pete Carroll, it has been fired, is not coming out of anyone's mouth. I'm just letting you guys. I mean, that's not going to happen. It will be they parted ways. He decided to retire so you're not going to get that headline. Now someone's going to try and put it out there, but that's just not what's going to happen. If Pete Carroll ends up not being the head coach of Seattle, it will be due to his decision, whether that be your scenario of him not wanting to relinquish, control over player personnel, or it will be because he's decided for one reason that this is no longer where he wants to be. I know that we were disagreeing a bit, and I know I have this reputation of being a Pollyanna, but at the same time, there was certain things to me in the news that came out today it seemed to me logical. And that's why I said, it is logical to me for a coach who's going to be retiring in 1 to 2 years. He said he wasn't retiring this year. We all know he's not going to make it more than 2 to 3 years in the league. It's not going to have an 80-year-old Pete Carroll on the sideline. Okay, it's not going to happen. But no, well, I also never said Brady would play this long either. So who knows? But so I think that is important. That to me, it's a logical step to hand some of that off as you are working your way out the door. But at the same time, you're right. There's a lot of pride in that. It's something that you're absolutely right that he struggled with in other teams, and so I can see him wanting to hold on to that. But I just really, truly would be surprised if Pete Carroll, unless it was utterly his decision, is not the coach of the Seahawks. I could see other shifts before that, although the stuff coming out of Russ seems to be real Seahawks positive too. So I don't even know. I don't know. It's weird, but to me, it would be heartbreaking to me because it is truly then the end of this era. And Pete Carroll has so much to do with the success of what we have been living in the joy of for the last 10 years. And so that would be sad to me.
Yeah, man, I'm so on the fence on this one. I didn't expect to be, but like all year I've been looking pretty much ready for them to make a change, and we've talked about that. And I just really liked the direction we started to see emerge from the team. And it feels like now that changing that out puts a lot more into question, and that could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. So I think my reaction would be similar to yours, Dayna. I think it would be disappointment if we find out tomorrow that Pete's gone. That puts my faith into ownership, making good choices about who they hire and that they're going to bring in someone good. And I don't know. I think I have more faith in what I've seen from some of the play the last few weeks than I do in them finding another great coach. So that's I think kind of where I would end up if that news comes out. Jeff, Nathan, I mean, Jeff, I know you're like probably have your fingers crossed.
I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't be like devastated. I think that's probably Evan. But I think just, I said it before, that's the number one thing that like would get me fired up going into the offseason would just be seeing them going through like the coaching names to see who they bring in, to see who they hire, to see the new staff come together, to see like a new direction in terms of personnel. I think that would really be a shot in the arm for me because I know the last 2 games are exciting, but like we're 3 weeks away where they just like had an awful game against the Bears where we were just like, this franchise is done. So I don't want to put too much in the last 2 games. And if they came back and they rolled it back with Pete, and assuming Russell's back, I'm okay with that. I'm not going to be devastated, but I think at this point, I'm just ready to see fresh, new personnel ideas and get excited about the team again and see what they do in the offseason. That's my favorite. I love the offseason. So if we have all these new names coming in, that would be exciting for me.
All right, Nathan, you get last word on this one.
Yeah, so I pretty much am 100% agreement with Dayna on this. That like I at this point I would be very surprised for them to just fire him. I think that it's possible that they make an ultimatum with personnel. It's possible that they make an ultimatum with Ken Norton Jr. and maybe that's a line that he won't cross, right? For various reasons. So there's ways that he could leave. But this ownership is still a wild card. For all we know, they could be super crappy owners that just want to make a change and run their team and do something. And the other thing is too, I think in terms of like the options available to this team, if they do need to look for another coach, it's a good year. Some of your worst case scenarios here, it's like Mike Zimmer, which would not be a guy that would make me super excited, but I also wouldn't be super scared, right? I mean, talking about the double-edged sword of trying to improve on Pete and how you're probably going to get a worse coach. Well, Mike Zimmer's probably not much of a downgrade. Brian Flores is out there. And these aren't the sexiest names necessarily. Doug Peterson is out there. And that's before you get into like, the hot shot offensive coordinators like Mike McDaniels, who everyone's just drooling over these days. So there are options available. I think that as risky, I'm a pretty big Pete critic. But you can't deny that there's a big risk in moving on from him. And I think they have a lot of options at their fingertips this year.
No, I think that's well said. And I agree with a lot of that. I mean, Brian Flores, I just got so much respect for what that guy's done. I was shocked when that news came down. And it's just a reminder that, to your point, Nathan, you can have bad ownership, making bad decisions, Schneider in Washington, like it's not hard to look around the league and see just crap franchises and you trace it back to the ownership. So we are going to learn a little bit about the ownership. We've talked about that. It's in their hands now. Whatever happens from here on out is on them because this is an opening. So we had so much more to talk about. We were going to talk about free agents. We're going to, who we're going to bring back because we're like dying. Like there's so much stuff we want to talk about. The good news is we have the whole off season. So we will talk more about free agency next week. We already have the list of Seahawks free agents and which of them we would keep and which of them we expect the Seahawks to actually keep. We'll talk to you about that next time. We'll probably also start getting into our top free agent targets for the Seahawks, both positions, of note and others, and start looking at that. But first, tomorrow night, we will have Stacey Ross join Evan and I, assuming Evan is feeling up for it health-wise. But we're looking forward to tomorrow night's conversation. Stacey's great. If you haven't heard her before, smart, funny, and a great insider on all things Seahawks and Seattle sports. So looking forward to that conversation. Lucky to have her. So please drop in tomorrow night. That will be at 7 p.m. Pacific time. The event's already on YouTube, so you can find it there. And please click like on the show. We appreciate that. It helps people find out about it. Give a rating on Spotify, Apple Play, wherever you find our podcast. And then go over to patreon.com/hawkblogger, sign up, be part of this offseason conversation because there's going to be a lot of it. And we'd love to have you join. And we didn't get to do Patreon questions this week. We will incorporate those, I promise, as soon as we can. And maybe even tomorrow night. I'll see if we can do some Patreon questions with Stacy. Until then, I just want to thank Nathan Ernst at NathanE11 on Twitter, Jeff Simmons at Real Jeff Simmons on Twitter, and Dayna O'Gorman for flying all the way back to the mainland just to be part of this show, at Dayna OG on Twitter. It was wonderful to have you back and see your smiling tan face. So very jealous of that, as we are all very white, like white, pale. So thanks everyone for tuning in. It's gonna be an amazing off season one way or another, and we're gonna find out more pretty soon. There will be an emergency pod, you can be sure, if news breaks tomorrow that we need to talk about. So until then, take care, have a good rest of your night, and